Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My guest today is Professor Kate Bonansinga, Director, School of Art, College of Design, Architecture, Art and Planning at the University of Cincinnati. Kate, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on, and I'm very happy to be kicking things off again with you as my first guest.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Wonderful. So where are you calling in from today?
I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, in my office in the College of Design, Architecture, Art and Planning at University of Cincinnati. Well, it's a nice Friday afternoon here.
Oh, wonderful. It's a hot day over here in New York as well.
Same here, up to 90 today, Fahrenheit. Yeah.
Well, let's start things off on this hot afternoon. Let's talk a little bit about the DAAP Center and your role there as the director of the School of Art. What does your position entail, and what's going on there at the DAAP Center? Any recent developments or any information you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the director of the School of Art, as you mentioned. I oversee art history, art education, and fine art. And we have those programs combined serve about 400 students. The biggest program is fine art, and then art history and art education are a little bit smaller than that one. But we have multiple graduate degrees and multiple undergraduate degrees. So we're training makers as well as scholars in my school. And my partner schools are design, architecture, and planning. And in the School of Design, we have communication design, fashion design, industrial design. In architecture, we have architecture and interior design. And then in planning, we have community planning, horticulture, and I think those are the two, urban planning as well. So it's a really rich mixture of creative practitioners here in our college, which is about a total of 2,400 students embedded in a large state university, which serves about 45,000 students. So it's like a small town here on campus. We have multiple campuses as well. We're very proud of the architecture on campus. We've commissioned several important architects to design buildings for us, including Michael Graves, Peter Eisenman, who designed the building that our college is in. Bernard Sumi is another one, Morphos Design in San Francisco. It's a really terrific collection of architecture, and walking for a few moments on campus, you really get the feeling that we've invested a significant amount of thought and resources in creating an urban campus that is pleasing for our students, faculty, staff, and the general public as well.
Wow. Well, I've had the pleasure of visiting with you there at the DAAP Center and at the University of Cincinnati. And I can say it is a fantastic campus. And like you say, it's almost like a menagerie of different architectural styles. For me, it's one of my favorite campuses worldwide. I love it. And the fact that you have these very modern, stark buildings, all kind of nestled together there, it's wonderful. Yeah. And I think it adds to the feeling of the interdisciplinarity that you sort of celebrate in the DAAP Center. And I think you've kind of highlighted that just in the proximity of all these different disciplines. Do you feel like there's a lot of collaboration at the school?
There is, certainly within our school, amongst the various disciplines, there is a lot of collaboration, as well as across the schools. So you often find an architect collaborating with a fine artist, or a planner collaborating with an art historian, which is a project I'll tell you about a little bit further into our conversation. So yes, there is a lot of support for and interest in cross-programmatic connection. Yeah, absolutely. That's what makes it so rich and interesting, intellectually rich and interesting, in my opinion. Yeah. And students working with faculty and reaching across colleges as well. We have a few programs with the College of Arts and Sciences. We have an art therapy certificate program that bridges our college with theirs, because psychology is embedded in arts and sciences. And of course, fine art is here in my school. So about half of the students in the art therapy program are psychology majors, and about half are fine art majors. And so to create a classroom environment where you have equal number of each of those disciplines, and sort of bringing those thought processes together is really a fascinating thing to observe and be part of. So yeah, there is definitely a motivation on campus for us to connect and work together. Yeah, and we're only about a 5-minute drive from downtown as well. We've got a very a wonderful array of art museums here, the Cincinnati Art Museum, the Contemporary Art Center, and the Taft Museum of Art are all within just a few minute drive of the university. So that's really helpful to us as far as our ability to educate our students, not only in how to observe and understand art, but also creates opportunities for them to intern and co-op at those institutions.
Oh, excellent. No, I've always thought that Cincinnati really does pack a punch when it comes to art, galleries, curation, and all these other disciplines. So it's and it was through my visits to the DAAP Center that I really learned how much of an art hub Cincinnati is. Do you feel the pandemic has affected Cincinnati and the art scene there? Are things back up and running? Have there been? I'm sure there's been a lot of challenges, but are things sort of back to some form of new normal now?
Yes, they are back up and running. Museums are open. At this point, we don't have a mask mandate in the city, though we have had an uptick in cases recently. So yes, everything's reopened, re-energized. Everyone was really happy to have access again to original and physical works of art, which when the museums closed, our only access was in public art, which was one of the reasons why I was so interested in continuing to pursue that sort of course of study and that endeavor, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about later. But yeah, the museums are open and welcoming people. And people are I think audience numbers have almost achieved their pre-COVID levels at this point.
Excellent. Well, and I'd also just like to say it's been great from Intellect perspective, partnering with the university, working with your school and people from within it and from across the DAAP Center as well. The university has our entire journals collection, which is great. So if anyone's tuning in from the university, go to the library and check out all the different Intellect journals that you have available there. Some fantastic interdisciplinary journal publications for you to check out.
Absolutely. And even if you're not in a university affiliate, you're welcome to use our libraries and read the journals in the library. So I welcome anyone to come and access all of the great publications that you provide to our libraries.
Oh, well, that's great to know. I didn't realize it was open to the public. That's a great idea, and I wish more institutions would follow suit. That's excellent news.
Absolutely. Anyone can walk in and browse the stacks and read a book.
Okay. Speaking of books, we've also published a lot of different books with the department as well. So, for example, the Research and Design book series, which was co-funded by the DAAP Center. So thanks to the University of Cincinnati for their really meaningful and interesting partnership over the years. We look forward to continuing that work. But Kate, let's move on and talk a little bit about you and tell us about your pathway. So you're the director of the School of Art. How did you end up in that position? Did you start your life as an artist, or did you come to that through scholarship? What's your educational background?
Yeah, so I have a background in art history. I have a master's degree in art history from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And my very first position after graduate school was at the Oregon College of Art and Craft, which was in Portland, Oregon. It recently closed. It had been in operation since 1907. And it's became a degree granting institution in the 90s when I was there. They actually hired me to develop an art history program so they could become a degree granting institution. And then about a decade or so later, they decided to discontinue operations, which was really unfortunate, but it was founded during the arts and crafts movement here in the United States. So while I was there, I really developed an interest and expertise in art that walks the line between fine art and fine craft. And then did that for about 10 years. I ran their gallery and launched their art history curriculum and program and their image library. And then I maximized that position and wanted to sort of change my scenery and try a new place. And I moved down to El Paso, Texas, which is in the western edge of Texas and also on the US-Mexico border. And I began there as the director of their art gallery at the University of Texas at El Paso. I went from a small studio art school to a large state institution. They had a really innovative art faculty and were interested in sort of increasing the profile of their art gallery, which was part of the art department. And within a few years, I worked with the president of the university to repurpose an existing campus building that had fallen into disuse to be a university art museum. So that was a really terrific opportunity. She and I collectively sort of did the fundraising required for the renovation of the building and sort of the reconstruction, so to speak, so that it would be an appropriate place for the exhibition and exhibition of art, as well as educating the public about it. It was an outward facing wing of the university. And I created the artistic sort of trajectory, let's put it that way, of the museum to focus on the US-Mexico border, because that was the research agenda of the university. So I was in a really privileged position to commission artists to somehow respond to that geographic divide between Mexico and the United States. And also many artists were interested in the environmental fragility of the high desert landscape, which is also where El Paso is situated. So a lot of interesting artists, and hired a really terrific assistant director who is currently the director. So she's been director for about the past decade, because in 2012, I moved from that position again, sort of maximize my potential there, I felt, and came to this job. I've been in El Paso for 12 years and then moved to this one in 2012. So I've been here for 10 years now. Unbelievable. To me, it seems like time just passes so quickly, even though COVID sort of did something weird with time for all of us, I think, but it still feels like the time has gone quite quickly. So entered academia through the back door, really, because I'd been at a like institution in El Paso, but had not been embedded in curricular planning, faculty management, sort of student, attempting to maximize student satisfaction and faculty productivity and also satisfaction. And that's what I do now, is I really, we're in the constant process of shaping and reshaping our curriculum and our environment best to serve our faculty and students. So I went from being a curator, museum director, to being a professor and really I'm not going to say manager, but a leader in at a different capacity, because I have so many other people that I'm responsible now for. In El Paso, my staff was very lean and mean. There were several student interns and then 3 professionals who reported to me. And now I've moved to, more than 20 people reporting directly to me, and then hundreds of students that are really under my watch and care. So it's a much sort of bigger position for me. And the reason I've made the shift, I actually really miss curating, and I try to do that as much as I can on a freelance basis, as sort of it really is my research as an academic. It's the way I express myself as a researcher, is by curating exhibitions. So I do miss that part of the job that I once had, but I have really enjoyed sort of the increase that I have felt in my influence here, because I have a bigger footprint, so to speak. So directly on people in the museum, I think there was a lot of indirect influence, because so many people would come to the exhibitions and experience the work I was doing in that respect. But here it's more direct, I guess I would say, because these folks are reporting directly through me. Yeah, so that's my background. That's how I came to it. And while I was in El Paso, after earning a master's in art history, I earned a master's in business administration on a part-time basis. So that's my interesting combination of degrees. And the reason I decided to do that was because I felt like I was spending, it wasn't about feeling, I actually was spending most of my time managing finances and people. And I felt like I really wanted to have some academic background to my day-to-day learning experience. So that's why I endeavored to earn that degree while I was working full-time. I went on a part-time basis. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about curatorial practice then.
Yeah.
It's an area that Intellect's especially interested in, and we have our journal Curatorial Studies.
I know that. Yeah.
As well, which I know you should be aware of. So yeah, well, have there been any big changes in curatorial practice or in the study of curation? It sounds like you've been involved in curation for a good while now. So yeah, have there been some big shifts I mean, maybe technology is, I mean, especially virtually, I imagine with a lot of virtual exhibitions and things like that. But yeah, what anything you'd like to say about curatorial practice and any changes that have occurred?
Yes, I would say during the time I've spent curating, which has been since 1991. I started my career in Portland, Oregon, as I mentioned, in 1991, and I was the director of the gallery at the art school. And it's interesting to me because, as I mentioned, that institution focused on fine craft, and I find a lot of similarities to sort of the definition of and the sort of the struggle for artists who worked in craft media, such as ceramics, fiber, wood, to sort of define themselves as equal to, or at least side by side with, artists who identified as sculptors and painters, or were trained to be those two things. And I see a similar struggle happening in the public art realm, that public art is sort of struggling for the same sort of recognition and respect that art that's exhibited in museums currently enjoys. So there's a parallel that I saw happening in the 90s. I think that conversation about the art craft divide is actually finally resolved. I don't think people aren't talking about that anymore, at least not in the with the same earnestness and sort of same concern that they were several decades ago. I think that artists working in all different media are equally accepted. And the market's a little, I'm not talking about the art market. I'm talking about more from a sort of intellectual and sort of critical standpoint. I think that artists working in all materials are equally valued now. And the other thing that I see as an important development, when I was first starting my career, social practice work was in its infancy. And now it's become a very important method for artists to express themselves. And that also comes into play when we start talking about art in the public sphere, because community involvement and agency is really important in both of those types of art making and practice. So I would say those are, that's a couple of the big changes and sort of, changes that I have observed during my time as a professional curator. Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
Like technology, like video, the technology as a medium has really improved and perfected itself, and as an option for artists of working in many different materials.
I was actually going to just say, have you personally been involved in any virtual curation projects? I know I've spoken to a few people who have been using Zoom or using different platforms to curate online exhibitions or interactive kind of platforms where people are creating live across the world kind of thing using different technologies.
I completely embrace that method, but I have not personally endeavored to organize a virtual exhibition, though I would love to do that at some point. I think it's a great opportunity to reach a lot of people and, again, sort of make a difference.
Definitely. Yeah. It certainly potentially could democratize access to artworks. And I think it's, just talking about public art and museums, I suppose you're increasingly seeing museums have their full catalogs available virtually, that people can tour the museum. And I think during the pandemic, that became really important, and the New York Opera being sort of globally broadcast to different cinemas and directly into people's living rooms through screens and things of that nature as well. So that kind of content seems to be quite common now. I think it's, like you said, it's a good thing for democratizing access and widening participation.
Agreed. Yep.
I quite often get frustrated with myself because I'm in New York and I think, I've never been to the opera, I should go to the opera. And then you look at the price tag and you're like, it's a little tricky. So it's kind of difficult, even when you're like in the home of all of these different of the arts.
Yeah.
Still can be difficult to access them. So I think some of these technological advancements have really enabled that.
Absolutely. Yep.
But while we're mentioning public art, and it's something that you've raised a couple of times there,
Yeah.
I think it's a term that's, it's kind of shrouded in mystery for some people. So could you just give us a very, brief definition of what you perceive public art to be? And maybe we can just talk about that a little bit.
Yes. So I would say it's artwork in public space, so that there's no barriers to experiencing it. It's there for anyone who wants to be there next to it with it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without the price of admission. So it's in a place that's accessible day and night to everyone.
That's great. A bit like the...
It's different from art in the domestic sphere, which is private, clearly, and also different from museums, which have a sort of gateway that one enters, pay for your ticket, and even museums that are free of charge, there's still that, I'm not going to call it a barrier, but there's that action of actually crossing the threshold. So people are sort of expecting, or they are expecting to experience art, whereas in the public realm, that might not be the case. You might just stumble upon it or experience it without really planning to do that, which I think adds a whole different level of opportunity and responsibility for that artwork.
That's definitely interesting. I wanted to ask you about that as well, and what you see as maybe the primary differences between the impact of public art and that of art in the museum setting.
Well, I think there's a few things. First of all, the access is multiplied for public art. So the audience can be larger. I mean, it's some of the really big museums that I think the audiences are huge, but for the right artwork placed in the right place in the public realm, it's just like this constant level of potential and activity surrounding it as people sort of pass by or actually pilgrimage to it, depending upon their intention and what their their daily activity looks like. So I think that just not knowing, from the artist's perspective, not knowing what kind of audience might experience it is one of the bigger challenges of public work, versus a museum audience that has every expectation to be with art. It's a more specific demographic in the museum than in public space, as far as the audience goes. And then also it needs, like, from a physical perspective, it needs to survive the elements of whatever weather is typical of the particular climate within which it's situated. And then as a visual statement, I think there's a lot of pressure for it to sort of stand out, not only complement its surroundings, but also make a statement beyond those surroundings. So I think there's a lot of different considerations for artists who are working in the public realm to consider. That might be a little more different from museums, which can be much more, understated, maybe subtle there that is might not be as a priority in the public work, which I think needs to really hold its own in an environment where there's a lot of activity not related to it taking place. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. I guess you've kind of gone on to my next as well. That you've kind of highlighted, I think, some of the challenges and rewards that are faced by artists who are operating within the public sphere. Are there any other, key issues that people need to, be aware of when they're
keeping in mind what we've been talking, referring to COVID, there was this moment when museums and galleries were closed, where the only access, if you didn't have the privilege of having original works of art in your home, which most people don't, then the only access you had to original works of art was art in the public sphere. So that's when it became really clear to me that this was a very, very important, let's call it a genre or a type of cultural expression, was public art. It became really important to me as a frequent museum goer that had that privilege robbed from me because the museums were closed by necessity, I would visit public sculptures and murals that I knew of more frequently, just to have sort of fulfill that need in myself, me as a viewer.
That's interesting. That taps into some of my own experiences. I think I moved to New York just prior to the pandemic, not long before the first lockdown. So all of my dreams and expectations and aspirations for being in New York, especially galleries and visiting the different art spaces, they became, sort of impossible. But Intellect was publishing a lot of different books that related to graffiti at the time, and I have a personal interest in graffiti art as well. So I ended up just maybe like through Instagram and different online platforms, sort of ascertaining where certain big murals and art pieces and graffiti pieces were, and then sort of walking and tracking them down. So but then as a result of that, I was walking all around the different boroughs, but especially through Brooklyn, and I was experiencing the city, during the pandemic, often with very few people around, but just walking sort of transiently between different spaces. And although I was heading to see one specific mural, I actually often didn't make it there and encountered hundreds of different murals and pieces within, different landscapes, whether it be around cement factories or, in hipster neighborhoods around fancy bars. And it was really interesting to see the same artists in different spaces, some inhabiting the space as a vandal, as a criminal, and at other times paid to produce the same artwork. And I find that sort of dichotomy quite interesting. But yeah, it does. It's subsequently though, I find it quite interesting that you walk around the city and you see pieces of graffiti or murals that had been created illegally or were once, by artists who were illegal. A bit like with Basquiat being Samo, the graffiti tagger back in the 80s, and then people who own buildings and businesses that employ these illegal artists, pay them to then create artworks to fancy up their own spaces. So not really public spaces, private buildings, but because they're on the exterior, they're public artworks and they're in the public sphere for everyone to see.
Right.
And what I've seen recently in New York, and maybe it's the same in Cincinnati and definitely in other cities I've been to, is you then have advertising companies paying artists who are either part of the graffiti scene or who exhibit on the liminalities of it, and then they kind of copy the style of graffiti and street art murals for corporations and for big brands to then produce and promote these huge pieces which are actually paid for by PepsiCo or something else. And it's very interesting because recently saw this huge wall go up in Brooklyn of very traditional big graffiti pieces, letter pieces, but it had been sponsored by PepsiCo because it was completely labeled and advertised all around these graffiti pieces. So you kind of, on one hand, things are being co-opted, but on the other hand, it's completely, it's enabling art in the public sphere. So it's kind of an interesting, collision there.
Yeah. And that's, you bring up a good point. Like when you said, what is public art? I think if you really want to dig into the weeds, truly public art is in public space. So federal or state or municipal space owned by the collective, i.e. the taxpayers, and ideally paid. The public art is at least in part paid for by the taxpayers. And there is a public vetting process toward the selection of the art. So that would be like the truest work of public art. But then there's all these other types that are privately funded or on, as you said, private property that is visible to a broad public or visible from the street. So there's a lot of different, one of the classes I taught a couple of years ago, I co-teach a class called Art in Public Space with my colleague from the School of Planning. He brings an architecture, urban design background to the conversation, and I bring the fine art and curatorial background to the conversation. And one of the things that we tasked our students with a couple of years ago is to create a rubric of different types of public art. So like from that truest perspective, funded by, selected by the public on a public piece of property, to a much more privatized type, but that is visible. by anyone who happens to be walking by. So we've got a rubric. It's sort of checkpoints of which is the truest and which is, still could be considered public art, but not quite as true as the other type.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Well, and I had another question that relates to sort of terminology that I hear people use often that maybe some of the audience aren't aware of as well. Within debates around the art in the public sphere or public art, we often hear about site-specific artwork.
Yeah.
So could you briefly just tell us what site-specific or site-based artwork is, and maybe just highlight some of the rewards and challenges that are associated with that form of art practice as well?
So site-based work is artwork that's developed for a particular place. It's not conceptualized and created by an artist in isolation of consideration of what the site looks like or is. So that, especially sculpture, develops in all different ways. Sometimes a public space will invite a sculptor to move his, her, or their sculpture from their studio to that space without consideration, having considered the spot for while he or she was making it. So it was artist driven and then moved to a space. But site-based work or site-specific work, site-specific is really artwork that is made only for that site. And the most, I'll call it infamous case, was Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which was created for the Federal Plaza in New York. His argument was the only place this sculpture can exist is in that plaza.
Right.
That would be definitely true blue site-specific. Site-based work is more about having the site drive the meaning and the aesthetic of an artwork. And then one that's completely not related to the site is the one that the artist conceptualizes without even knowing that site exists, for example, and then later maybe the piece is moved to that place.
Well, thanks for clearing that up. That's I definitely didn't know. I definitely didn't. I thought I knew the answer to that, but I didn't. Yeah. So that's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I want to get on to some of your work with NASAD in a second, but prior to that, we've kind of mentioned a pandemic a little bit and public art. So I was interested about this intersection between public art and public health, which I believe is something that you've been involved in with several organizations. So yeah, how about it? What are some of those intersections, and how is the pandemic, or without necessarily specifically referencing it, how has the world changed now? Looking at, I mean, the pandemic was very negative in many ways, but it has also created these silver linings where it's changed how we use technology and how we influence, how it influences art and things of that nature. But, this idea of art and health, I think, has come to the forefront, and space. Absolutely. As well.
Mm-hmm. So I think that art can impact emotional health without a doubt, because it creates connection between people and also it creates beauty. So I think that's really uplifting emotionally for people. But I've been sort of probing the ability for art to also impact physical health through a recent project, a team-based project that I'm working on with several professors here in the College of Design, Architecture, Art, and Planning, as well as a professor from the College of Medicine who's a public health specialist. And what we have done is, through an internal grant from the Office of Research, from the Vice President of the Office of Research here at University of Cincinnati, we commissioned 2 artists to implement a mural on one of the many staircases in Cincinnati, which is a city of hills. We're located in the Ohio River Valley. So back in the late 19th century, several staircases were built for people who would work in the valley downtown and then walk home from work, which was at that point the suburbs, which is where the university is now located, is on a hill sort of overlooking the city. So there's hundreds of these staircases throughout the city. And we've selected one of them that is highly visible, pretty highly trafficked, that connects a couple of neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods have different socioeconomic demographics. So that staircase literally connects people of differing demographics. And then it also creates an incentive. The artwork now creates an incentive to climb the stairs, because as you do that, you experience the work in a different way. What the artist did was draw, it's in a very heavily wooded area. So there's lots of trees all around. In fact, it's right beside an important and large and beautiful park. So they've abstracted some of the natural flora and fauna from around the area and applied that as a mural to the risers on the stairs.
Very
So
cool.
what we're thinking, it was just finished a couple weeks ago, but we culled data from pre-implementation use of stairs. So we actually documented, counted the number of people who use them through a step counter, as a little mechanism that we attach to the railing of the stairs. And our thought is that now that we have that really great looking artwork there, that use of the stairs will uptick. So people will want to go there, climb the stairs, and through that action, they will increase their physical activity, which of course improves their physical health. So I would love to do a longitudinal study, like how did the use increase, and overall, how did people's well-being improve? So that's what the College of Medicine member of our team is working towards, is creating some focus groups. Well, she'll talk to people in the neighborhood who are familiar with the stairs and use the stairs, how it's changed the way and the frequency with which they use the stairs, and how it's changed the neighborhood identity and the way they feel about themselves and their place.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And so hopefully this will be a pilot. We're treating it as a pilot project, and we hope to implement different types of artwork on many different staircases in Cincinnati. Not necessarily always paintings. We could do sculpture, we could do sound work, we could do performance platforms. I think there's all sorts of different options. But we did vet these artists through a community-based process. So we had a number of focus groups where we talked to the neighborhood residents about what they aspired to as far as artwork on the stairs. And they also actually selected the artist team. We gave them a number of options that we culled through a request for qualifications. And then the neighbors themselves chose the artist to commission. And they made a great choice because the artist did a really good job. I'll send you some pictures.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I think that's what a wonderful experiment. What a really practical and interesting way to utilize art in public space. If people want to find out more about that and the ongoing project, is there a website or anything they can take a look at?
Yeah, it's called Step Up to Art Lab.
Cool.
I'll also send you a link too.
Wonderful. So Step Up to Art Lab. So yeah, I'd encourage people to check that out.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, talking about things that you're working on, is there anything else that you're kind of currently focusing on, either academically or in terms of curation or other projects?
Well, I recently completed curating an exhibition that I was really proud of called Sounding Labor Silent Bodies, Tanya Candiani. And Candiani is the name of the artist. She's a Mexico City-based artist, really smart, compassionate, wonderful artist who happened to represent, with a colleague, she represented Mexico in the 2015 Venice Biennale. And with that sort of catapult to recognition, which she well deserved, I invited her to come to Cincinnati to present her artwork to our students. And that was in 2017. And to her credit, she became so fascinated with our city and its industrial past, because we were a locus of many avant-garde industries in the late 19th century. So we had built a fantastic music hall. We had woodwork, like a big woodworking enterprise here, a lot of foundries here. There was pork manufacturing here, many different types of industries that were really ahead of their time and progressive in the way they were doing things. And she's interested in industrial technology and industry as sort of concepts and how they've influenced our world over the course of history. And so she really dug into those last 2 decades of the 1800s here in Cincinnati and created 5 new artworks that reference them. And the largest one was a 3-channel video installation where she that conveyed a film of the Muse Choir, which is a social justice choir, all women, based here in Cincinnati. It's auditioned, but it's also volunteer. And we filmed them in one of these, a former brewery, because this was a seat of beer manufacturing, as well as the other industries I mentioned. We filmed them replicating the sounds of the machines that once were, with their voices. So it was this interesting sort of change where typically machines supplant human labor. In this case, the human voice supplanted the mechanized sound. So it was a fantastic experience and a fantastic piece. It's called For Industries, and she focused on pork, metal, woodworking, and printmaking. In fact, it's currently on view. That very piece is on view at the university, the Federal University in Mexico City right now, because she has a retrospective exhibition on view there, and it's part of that retrospective. So again, I can send you a link to that museum website, and maybe you can share that with the audience. But that is one project. It premiered during COVID. It opened, it was supposed to open in April 2020. And of course, at that point, museums were closed here in Cincinnati. It was just 2 months after COVID, you know, after the federal government sort of was closing down the United States. So we postponed opening until July of 2020, but I was so happy that we even opened the exhibition. And then it continued until January of 2021. So it's been about 18 months since we closed the exhibition, but it was a really stunning and beautiful response. And so that's an example of site-based work, I would say, because it was really responding to the history of this place, and yet it's transferable to other venues as well. So that's a good example of site-based artwork. But her work was mostly video, film and video, some drawings, and then we also used some archival ephemera from that period that we borrowed from museums.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sounds very cool, and I hope that people can manage to view that after watching this video.
Yeah.
I'd also just like to ask you if there's any other artists or creatives that perhaps we should keep our eyes out for. Has anything caught your attention recently? Anyone else you want to give a shout out to?
Well, I will give a sort of a shameless plug for one of our recent Master of Fine Arts graduates, whose name is Josie Love Roebuck. And she has a representative in New York City called the Latchkey Gallery that I think she has an exhibition on view right now. But she was recently featured in a show at Kavi Gupta Gallery in Chicago, and she is definitely an artist to watch out for. She is just creating incredible textile-based work about self-identity and her place in our world, which I think a lot of people will identify with.
Awesome. Well, to be honest, Kate, that sounds like a perfect place to draw this to a conclusion. So
Okay.
I do thank you so much for your time and for joining me today on In Conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Do you have any final thoughts or anything else you'd like to add before we draw this to a conclusion?
Just go out and see some art.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
watching this will do that next in their day.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me on In Conversation. Until next time, thanks for everyone tuning in. Cheers.
It's been a pleasure. Bye, James.
Thanks, Kate.
Bye-bye.